All black, everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back, black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're here at the John Hope Franklin Center. In studio today, our guest is Daryl Atkinson, who is the staff attorney for the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. How are you doing today, Daryl?
Great, great. Thanks for having me, Mark.
Talk a little bit about the work that you do for the coalition.
Sure. So the Southern Coalition for Social Justice is a civil and human rights advocacy organization in Durham, North Carolina. We operate on a community lawyering model, meaning that we basically serve as general counsel for the most vulnerable communities across the state of North Carolina and across the Southeast. Over our 7-year history, that's resulted in 4 main issues being identified by our communities as most important. Those include the protection of voting rights, criminal justice reform, environmental justice, and we have a catch-all bucket that we call human rights, where we can be a little bit nimble to respond to some of the community's needs. And what we found is that the same community that the General Assembly is trying to racially gerrymander their district is the same community where they want to site the mega landfill. It's the same community where police are engaging in disproportionate stops, searches, and arrests for low-level drug arrests. So these communities are getting hit from a number of different perspectives and a number of different issues. And we are multi-issue, multidisciplinary, and we basically want to offer them a toolbox where if they need the screwdriver of litigation, if they need a hammer of media advocacy, whatever those communities might need where they traditionally wouldn't have the resources to have those tools at their disposal themselves, we try to provide them.
One of the things that the coalition is involved in, this whole idea of criminal justice reform. And very often when the public hears criminal justice reform, what they're thinking of are better ways of policing, more stringent, punishment for crime, right? The tact of the coalition is very different, right? You're actually talking about much more effective and humane, criminal justice system in terms of, you mentioned low-level crime, drug offenses, et cetera.
No, that's absolutely right. And if I could even expand upon that a little bit more, we've been doing a bit of thinking inside our organization and what we want our public message to be around criminal justice. And when we think about where we are at this moment in time with regards to this country and the state of North Carolina, our prison population is as big as it's ever been, both from a contemporary perspective and historically. We have nationally 65 million people with a criminal record. In North Carolina is 1.6 million people. That's 1 in 6 adults over the age of 16. And you might say, why would he say adults over the age of 16? Because North Carolina prosecutes children. And I'm very purposeful with my words here. Children who are 16 and 17-year-olds and treat them as adults, unlike many other states across the country. And so the breadth of our criminal justice system has expanded beyond the proper size. And we really want to shrink that system. We really want to have more of an abolitionist kind of frame, because we don't really believe that this current system is functioning well and properly for the communities that we represent.
Talk a little bit about how you got engaged in this work. I mean, what was your backstory that drove you, to be involved in what is very compelling work at this point in time?
I appreciate that question because I think it's critically important on what brings people to the work. I didn't one day wake up and say, I want to go in mass incarceration. That's my thing to do, if you will. My personal experiences brought me here. In 1996, I was convicted of a first-time nonviolent drug crime. I explain the characteristics of my crime to not create any hierarchy amongst people who might have committed other types of offenses. That's just my truth. And out of that experience, I had to serve a mandatory minimum of 40 months. There was no downward departure. There was no safety valve. It was no way I could not serve that time in a cage. And it was very, very difficult on me and my family. I went into prison with a high school diploma. I came out with a high school diploma. The state of Alabama wasn't nearly as progressive as many other states. in offering post-secondary opportunities. You couldn't even take correspondence courses. I was released in November 1999, and fortunate enough for me, I returned to a loving family that could provide me food, clothing, and shelter.
And everybody doesn't have that kind of support
And
system.
everybody doesn't have that kind of support system. And fortunate enough for me, I returned to that kind of support system, so I didn't have those immediate pressures pressing down upon me. As a result, I could work a plan and achieve some success. I was able to get my associate's degree, my bachelor's degree, my law degree. I'm licensed to practice law in Minnesota and North Carolina. And I don't share that story, Mark, to highlight any exceptional attributes that I have. I don't have delusions of grandeur that there's something oh so special about me. The only thing that separated me from 1,000 men that I spent time with behind the wall is that I had that support system. We could have more success stories if we created viable support systems for people to return to, because not everyone is going to have that kind of family. We do that with the programs that we set up for people who are returning. We do that with the policy and the environment that we set for folks that welcomes them back into our communities and creates a policy framework where they can be successful and have access to opportunity.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Daryl Atkinson, who's the staff attorney for the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, talking about issues like criminal justice and mass incarceration. We were on a panel together at Duke Law School a little while ago, and you began your comments with something that I just found so striking. In all the conversation that we have had about Ferguson, right, the aftermath, the beforehand, you mentioned that Ferguson does not happen outside of the context of mass incarceration. Expound upon that, for our audience.
So the state-sanctioned violence that we saw in Ferguson, Missouri, the violence of that individual officer against Michael Brown, the violence of the police response to people trying to peacefully protest and exercise their constitutional rights, I would submit cannot happen outside of the larger context of putting 2.2 million people in cages. It functions, it's a byproduct of operating within that larger context, because we have made normative the state controlling black and brown, disproportionately controlling black and brown bodies that way. So it's normative for the state to respond with tanks and machine guns and tear gas. It's normative.
Because that's what you do with people in cages.
That's what you do with people who deserve to be in cages, because you treat them as if they're animals. So it's normative for a police officer, based on the facts that we know, to shoot down a man who had his hands up. And mass incarceration exists within a larger historical narrative where the state and institutions of the state have been waging war in many respects against black and brown folks since we got here in 1619.
One of the things that we've talked about, we were talking before this interview about some of the collateral damage associated with Ferguson, and you mentioned just the kind of secondary trauma that not only for people who are in Ferguson, but for those of us who are watching this from the outside and dealing with our own relationships with the criminal justice system, our own relationships with law enforcement, that at some point this is impacting upon our bodies and who we are. Talk a little bit about the struggles to be able to articulate that, to a wider public.
Sure. And I was making it really, really personal with the respect that, prior to my comments on the panel that day, I really had to self-modulate. I could feel my blood pressure rising because here we were once again talking about the blatant and wanton disregard of black safety, of the lives of black men, and really being very, very frustrated about how many times are we going to have this conversation. And that secondary trauma of doing the work on a day-to-day basis and seeing there's a Ferguson near you in these little mini stories, looking at who mainstream media chooses to rally around and the stories that they choose to amplify, who is almost worthy of painting a narrative around, and we very much try to paint those narratives in innocence. I was sharing with you a buddy of mine named Dorsey Nunn, a formerly incarcerated man who leads an organization called All of Us Are None, is an executive director of legal services for prisoners with children in Oakland, California. He put it this way in a talk that he gave, and we were talking on the phone. He was like, my son may not be going to get iced tea and Skittles. He may well be going to get a blunt and a 40, but I still expect him to come home without getting murdered in the streets. And very often I watch some of our traditional civil rights organizations, mainstream media very much rally behind the victims who are more framed as innocent or perfect or deserving of our sympathy and empathy and advocacy, whereas some of our other brothers and sisters who may not be perfect, they aren't deserving of that same attention, and that's very, very troubling for me.
In some ways, that that kind of logic even adds to what we see in terms of mass incarceration.
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely.
You know, you've been yourself personally, and of course, the Southern Coalition for Social Justice has been intimately involved in issues of police brutality, police shootings, and general police harassment here in the city of Durham, part of a larger collective of organizations called FADE. And in some ways, if you could talk about, if you can accept that law enforcement admitting some wrongdoing is a victory, you've had some victories here in Durham. Can you talk a little bit about, the work that FADE has done to really challenge the Durham Police Department, in terms of, stop and, or stops in terms of and some stop and frisk issues, and of course, this almost rash of police killings of young folks, Black and Latino, that we've seen in the last 18 months.
Yeah. So fostering alternative drug enforcement, that coalition in Durham was really birthed out of remnants of some previous work that we had done with some communities here in Durham where we had advocated around ban the box. And some of those folks in those same communities, because we are very purposeful when we work with communities, it isn't about the Southern Coalition, it's really about giving those communities space and agency to be their own advocates. We're just at their disposal to be able to utilize our skill sets. And as a result, leadership was really identified in many of those communities, and those same leaders came back to us and was like, we got to get in front of this issue a little bit. It's great to create opportunities for people who've been involved in the system, but how can we stop or be preventive or more proactive and prevent our folks from coming in contact with the system in the first place? Hence FADE, because what they were seeing in their communities was that a lot of the people who needed a box banned so they can go get a job or housing or what have you, really were people who were being swept up in the drug war for low-level drug crimes. One of the tactics that is used in the drug war are these indiscriminate or searches where there's no probable cause, and then they roll up on the car.
More than 80% of those in Durham were people of color.
Absolutely.
So, that's just astounding on the face of it.
Yeah, so Durham County is about 37% African American, 84% of the searches are of Black folks. So, and then once again, that's operating under the presumption that Black folks have contraband in their cars more than whites, which statistically just is not true. In 1999, North Carolina passed a racial profiling act that requires that officers collect certain information. And part of that information is stop, race of the person who was stopped, and what was subsequently found, if anything, based on that stop. And so the hit rate, as we like to refer to it, between Blacks and whites is negligible. The difference is negligible. At Blacks, it's about 2% hit rate of all stops and searches attended to those stops, and whites is about 1%. But the vast majority of searches are of African Americans, so it's really an ineffective tool.
I mean, because a bunch of folks who might actually have contraband are going under the radar.
Exactly, because you're searching folks who don't have any.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's funny because that's stuff that we see that plays out in the classroom in terms of the kind of kids that end up in detention because folks are so focused on policing black bodies in the classroom, they're not paying attention to other bodies. So when we talk about this kind of from the school pipeline, from school to prison pipeline, I mean, we see that stuff playing out in the classroom as we do in terms of the criminal justice system.
So in addition to the human rights violations and the social inequity associated with these particular practices, they also are contrary to public safety. Yeah. Because if you're searching a bunch of innocent folk and spending all of your time and resources doing that, that means there are a bunch of bad actors who are riding around with contraband that you aren't getting to that could potentially be doing harm to us all.
When you think about the fact that there is almost an epidemic of meth use in this country, but yet there's such a fixation on marijuana use. And so, you hear all these narratives, and a lot of them are coming from law enforcement, that marijuana is kind of a gateway to these more dangerous drugs. Whether or not there's any science to back it up or not. And at least for black bodies, what that seems like it means is that then marijuana use becomes almost a gateway to the criminal justice system.
You're exactly right. And one of our more conservative city councilmen said exactly that. Wow. City Councilman Eugene Brown, older white gentleman, is not a raging progressive by any respects, but because of some of our advocacy with fostering alternative drug enforcement, some of our FADE advocacy and presenting people with facts and information and empirical data, Eugene Brown made this statement at a September 1st City Council meeting where he said, many people think of marijuana as a gateway drug. He said, I think of it as a gateway to prison. And we see so many of our young people who get these low-level arrests that end up putting them in contact with the criminal justice system. They get a record which thwarts their ability to get jobs, education, housing, which essentially leaves whole swaths of entire communities socially and economically marginalized from mainstream American life, hence the new Jim Crow. That's criminogenic in of itself, because what choices does that young person have to make now? I cannot participate in the mainstream. Essentially, it's a rational choice for me to go back to the block because that's the only company hiring in this company town.
Real talk. Right, and then not being able to vote, so you can't participate in the civic life of your community. We're here, you're watching Left of Black. We're joined by Daryl Atkinson, who's the staff attorney for the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. It's been an interesting moment, right? We're talking a year after the Zimmerman acquittal, the very visible killing of Eric Garner, of course, all the energy around Mike Brown, and even in that context, we're talking about dudes getting shot in Walmarts for playing with toy guns. I mean, it's a very particular kind of moment. But yet, the story that folks seem most fixated on post-Ferguson are these issues of black domestic abuse, right? Both of intimate partner abuse and also of children. And it feels like almost retribution, for folks speaking out and pushing back against what happened in Ferguson. How do you balance this kind of attention to what are issues that we need to pay attention to?
Absolutely.
But society seemed to be largely, unresponsive to, in the scale that it is now. Prior to Ferguson, suddenly post-Ferguson, everyone is concerned about policing black male bodies in certain kinds of ways.
No, that's an excellent point. And let me begin by saying both, what we have seen associated with the Ray Rice situation, as well as some of the other domestic violence and child abuse situations, are egregious conduct and should not be tolerated in any shape or form. Absolutely. I just want to make that statement to begin with. But when we look at the NFL and sports and how they're predominantly dominated by black men, and we see the almost hyper attention that these stories are getting right now, it feeds into the narrative of that hyper-violent black man, of the dangerous black man.
Who we value when they're on those 100 yards.
Sure, sure. Who we value as a commodity.
Right.
Which we have always thought of black bodies
right.
that way, as an economic commodity. We value them that way, but when the cost-benefit analysis starts hitting the bottom line, they become expendable.
Right.
Very similar to other forms of cash. So I think that is a very astute point for us to always pay attention to, and put it into context, because when you look at the rate of offending for people who are in the NFL, who are in sports, their rate of offending in relation to domestic violence, when you compare it to the larger population, is actually very low.
Right.
And then when you compare it to different vocational areas like law enforcement and prison guards, is even lower. So, you know, I think we need to really discuss these issues in context and make sure that we have the proper context. I want to pivot back for a moment, if I could, to a previous topic that we were discussing when we were talking about these stops and searches and the violence that's associated with some of the police brutality that we've been seeing here in Durham, as well as the disproportionate arrests for some of these low-level drug arrests, and the kind of community distrust and sentiment that's created because of those practices. And I want to draw an analogy. So, you know, when we were looking at the war in Iraq, when we went looking for the WMDs and that occupation in that particular area of the world, and what our occupation there meant to Iraqi folks, mainstream Iraqi folks, moderate folks, not jihadists, but because of our heavy footprint there and how heavy-handed our presence was there, these folks became radicalized in many respects and did not want us there, did not want our help, wanted us out, and in many ways became uncooperative with what we were trying to achieve there. Regular mainstream moderate folks. You can draw the same parallels with the police heavy-handed presence in predominantly communities of color. It's an occupation.
Right, most of law enforcement don't live in these communities, don't function in these communities, so it's almost like they're an occupying force.
Absolutely, and so you have grandmas who's sitting on the stoop who might very well have some good relevant information on something that bad that might have happened in the community, but they're not going to give it up, not because of a no snitching culture, but because they don't want to cooperate with people who they see doing harm, more harm than good in their community. So once again, I want to flip this not just from a social justice frame, because that's our dominant frame at SCSJ, but also tap into some larger American values that this is not good policing to keep any of our communities safe, because it produces ineffective results and they can't do their job at the level that they need to do it.
We've been joined today here in the John Hope Franklin Center on Left of Black by Daryl Atkinson, who's a staff attorney for the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. Thanks for sharing your wisdom and your expertise with us today, Daryl.
Thank you for having me, man.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black, culture over everything, y'all, we taking it back.